I'd like to issue a hearty welcome and appreciation for you coming out this afternoon for today's lecture. My name is Lindsay Whaley. I'm the Interim Vice Provost and the Associate Provost for International Initiatives and also a Professor of Linguistics and Cognitive Science, and I know nothing about counterterrorism, so I'm happy to be here and learn something about it. Want to alert everybody before I introduce our speaker today that there's a reception afterwards in the Rousseau Gallery just upstairs if you'd like an opportunity to interact more informally with everybody here, but especially with our speaker today, Dan Benjamin. So as most of you probably know, Dan Benjamin joined the Dartmouth community in January as the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. We're very happy to have you here, Dan. We're excited about what you bring to the community and are eager to learn from you and to interact with you. Dan Benjamin, Ambassador Benjamin, I should say, has started his career in journalism. So he did stints with Time Magazine and the Wall Street Journal. Most recently, he was the principal advisor for the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on counterterrorism, and he was actually the holder of that position for the longest period of time in the 30 years that that position has existed. He's also been on the National Security Council, the director of the Brookings Institute. He's an award-winning author. And today he will be speaking to us about counterterrorism, something that's right in his wheelhouse. So Dan, just without further ado, welcome and thank you for speaking.
Well, thank you very much, Lindsay, and it is really a great pleasure to be here today. Sort of a long delayed start, and as many of you know, my appointment was made last May, but I had a promise to my last boss that I would stick it out as long as I could, and so I'm particularly delighted to have this opportunity to speak with you today, and I'm especially pleased to do so as the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center. I'd like to think that the search committee, when it did its business, was looking for someone who embraced the values for which John Dickey is well known, and as I hope the speech to come will indicate, I embrace those values wholeheartedly. The notion of meeting the world's problems head on, of engaging the global community of creativity and imagination, and of having a real sense of global responsibility. I have to say it's a tremendous honor to now lead a center that is dedicated to these ideals and that bears his name. Well, as I think everyone will acknowledge, terrorism is perhaps the murkiest subject that everyone feels they need to know something about these days. It's true that by nature terrorist groups are secretive, clandestine, and that much of the work goes on in the dark. Much of counterterrorism goes on in the dark as well, and so it's very hard to keep a sort of running tally in your head or any sense of where we are in this effort. And the episodic explosions of headlines, of radicals taking over Mali, or hearings that may address issues of targeted killings and things like that, it's very hard to have a sense of context and a sense of clarity as to where we are. And so as someone who's been in the middle of this for quite some time, what I'd like to do today is try to shine a flashlight, if not a spotlight, on some of the key aspects of our counterterrorism effort and to give some idea of where we are in this endeavor. And it's a good time for doing so as we move into President Obama's second term. And I think that the right place to start, of course, is to imagine or think back where we were at the beginning of the president's first term when he took office almost more than 4 years ago. At that time, Al-Qaeda was still quite a formidable and dangerous organization. The core of Al-Qaeda, the group led by Osama bin Laden, was deeply dug into the federally administered tribal areas on the Afghan-Pakistan border, and it was still capable of committing catastrophic attacks. The group that carried out the 9/11 atrocities was still very much a threat, a force, a formidable foe, and although it had sustained some significant blows, it was really easy to imagine that it could come back to its former strength. But the trouble wasn't confined to Pakistan. Yemen, a country where we had largely been disengaged for about 8 years, had become a worrisome hotbed of terrorist activity. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had established itself as the first affiliate of Al-Qaeda with the determination and the capability of striking the United States. And we saw that clearly on December 25th, 2009, when you'll all remember the case of the infamous underwear bomber who tried to destroy an airliner bound for Detroit. The following year, the same group tried again with a plot to destroy several U.S.-bound airplanes with bombs timed to detonate in the cargo holds. That was the so-called printer cartridge plot. In Somalia, al-Shabaab controlled all but a few blocks of Mogadishu and most of south and central Somalia as well. Against this backdrop, the Obama team began its tenure with some thoughts about what needed to be done to be more effective. In general, we believed we had to be more comprehensive and more genuinely strategic in our approach, and we had to invigorate our diplomacy to strengthen the foreign partnerships that are absolutely critical for success. And we knew that while the military and the intelligence community and the law enforcement agencies were firing on all cylinders, civilian agencies here in the U.S., but also in governments around the world were not yet sufficiently engaged. And I think perhaps the overriding understanding was that the use of force was not going to do the job for us, that there had to be more than that. So with that in mind, we put a high priority on two key areas. One was capacity building, so that countries around the world could do a better job of dealing with the threats within their borders and their regions. And also the second area was that we had to address what have been called the upstream factors of radicalization. That is, we had to improve our work on countering violent extremism, or CVE as it's known in government parlance, so that we could blunt the attraction of violence and reduce the number of recruits to our enemy's cause. That's obviously one of the key standards of whether or not you're succeeding, whether more people are taking up arms against you. Well, today, 4 years later, I think things look very different on the ground and in the way that the United States is doing business. So if we look at South Asia, where it all began, Al-Qaeda's core has been seriously degraded. Without a doubt, Osama bin Laden's departure from the scene was the most important milestone in this effort. The removal of the group's founder and sole commander for 22 years was a testament to the work of countless intelligence and counterterrorism professionals across the government. And that operation demonstrated the extraordinary proficiency that the military and intelligence communities had achieved in counterterrorism. And I can tell you, and we can discuss this later, it would look nothing like Zero Dark 30. I think it's also important to note that it wasn't just bin Laden. The U.S. government has removed more than 20 of al-Qaeda's top 30 leaders in South Asia, and now the core group finds it very difficult to raise money, train recruits, and plan attacks outside of the region, and it is one deeply dispirited organization. In Yemen, the fight against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is a work in progress, but the trend lines, I'm happy to say, are positive. In particular, we know that we were fortunate in that a new president came to power, President Hadi, and the Yemeni people have really taken the fight on in a very serious way. So AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, after holding a very significant swath of territory, has been rolled back from those gains. And I think Yemen illustrates the value of a comprehensive approach to counterterrorism. While we were training Yemeni forces to do a better job against armed terrorists, we're also addressing the truly profound needs of the Yemeni people by assisting with the political transition that went on from the Saleh regime and by delivering humanitarian and economic aid. The United States is working hard with the international community to redouble and redouble again the support for Yemen. And we do this not only because it's right to help a country with Yemen's challenges, but also because this work addresses human needs, which, if unmet, can accelerate radicalization, and because it's absolutely vital that our partners know that we are in it for reasons other than solely our own security. In Somalia, after more than 2 decades of strife, we have had a political transition, and this is quite a remarkable development. There's a new provisional constitution, a new parliament, and a new president. And these are the hopeful signs of a new era in Somalia. And in that long-suffering country, we were able to achieve this point. And I say we because the United States played a really important role in training up the Somali National Forces and, above all, the African Union's mission in Somalia, AMISOM. That group got strong financial support and on-the-ground training in the surrounding countries from U.S. and Western partners. And AMISOM was able to expel al-Shabaab from the major cities of southern Somalia, and now al-Shabaab is out of Mogadishu. So while the group will undoubtedly try to carry out attacks against the new government and against neighboring countries, it's fragmented by dissension and it is much weakened. And I think that this is a positive story that has really not gotten the attention that it deserves. And while I am myself a product of the American press in some sense, I have to say I think it's a big mistake that this has not been gotten more attention. Well, all of this is good news, as we can agree, and I believe that the al-Qaeda core is on a path to defeat. The two most dangerous affiliates, while still posing serious threats, have suffered their worst setbacks in years. Now, if only we had a static set of challenges, we'd all be feeling great. But as everyone here knows, the tumultuous events of the last couple of years in the Middle East have changed that picture quite a lot. In Mali, the terrorists of al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, are attempting to expand their safe haven, and they threaten the stability of that state. Now, it's important to underscore that this is not the result of a long-term organic development and the growth of extremism, but rather from a sudden shock to the region, and that is the return of exiled fighters from the ranks of Muammar Gaddafi's army to northern Mali, and the subsequent Tuareg rebellion dispersed the use of dispersed weapons from the Libyan stocks, which were looted during the revolution, and the coup in Bamako. All that has brought a dangerous stability to the Sahel, and that is what has precipitated France's current deployment. But none of it was really foreseeable a few years ago, and had the Arab Spring not come and the Libyan revolution not happened, I think we would still be looking at the Sahel and saying it's not that big a problem. Well, in Libya, the aftermath of the revolution has also provided more opportunities for extremist groups to operate, and we saw so with the tragic death of Ambassador Chris Stevens and 3 others in Benghazi on September 11th. Weakened domestic security institutions and civil strife, we know from hard experience, create exactly the kind of environment the terrorists are drawn to. And Libya has provided one such case where extremists can cause real problems for states undergoing difficult transitions to democracy. Another example, and here I'm not quite sure where the transition is going to go, but another important example is Syria. And there, al-Qaeda in Iraq cadres are seeking to establish a long-term presence under the pseudonym of al-Nusra Front. And by fighting alongside armed Syrian opposition groups, these operatives are working to hijack a long-repressed nation struggle to suit their own extremist ends. They are trying to wrap themselves in the legitimacy of the opposition, but these terrorists, and they are terrorists, have been identified, and with any luck, that will serve as a warning to all those who wish to support the legitimate opposition of the Syrian people. But I'll be very frank, nothing scares me as much for the future as Syria. And the notion that an al-Qaeda franchise would have put down roots there in the Levant, next door to Israel, next door to Turkey, and really just a hop, skip, and a jump from Europe is something that I think really should be of great concern. Now, to add to this list of new challenges, in West Africa, we see the loosely organized collection of factions that's known as Boko Haram continue to carry out attacks in Nigeria. Here's another case where where there's a very specific context and a very specific set of problems. Boko Haram is exploiting the historical grievances of northern Nigerians to win recruits and public sympathy. I think if you separated northern Nigeria from the rest of the country and looked at it economically, it would be right up there with Mali and Niger as one of the poorest countries in all of Africa. The number and sophistication of Boko Haram's attacks is increasing, and while the group is focused principally on local Nigerian issues and actors, there are reports that it's developing financial and training links with other extremists and wants to operate on a bigger stage. Now, at this point, I have to make a bit of a detour from all the joys of Sunni-based terrorism and the non-state actors that I've been talking about, and note that there's also been a resurgence of state-sponsored terrorism, especially in the dangerous and destabilizing activities of Iran through its Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force and through Hezbollah. In addition to the support that the Quds Force and Hezbollah are providing the Assad regime in Syria to put down the rebellion there, over the past year there's been a significant, even dramatic escalation in Iranian-backed terrorism. Hezbollah's tempo of activity has reached a pace unseen since the 1990s, with attacks plotted in Southeast Asia, Europe, and Africa, and as is now clear, the group was responsible for the attack in Bulgaria last summer. The Quds Force has also sought to attack in Georgia, India, Thailand, and most brazenly in Washington, D.C., with the now famous plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador. We can also talk about that in the Q&A. That was one of my most interesting tasks, trying to convince foreign ministers around the world that this was serious, because no one believed that the Iranians would do anything quite so crazy. But indeed they did. So taking steps to confront this challenge has also been a major undertaking for Washington, and there's been a lot of work going on with intelligence, law enforcement, and diplomatic initiatives around the world. Some of you may be aware that the Justice Department actually seized $150 million from the Lebanese Canadian Bank, which was money that Hezbollah had gotten, and there was supposedly 300 million more of it, through a very complex scheme involving selling American used cars in West Africa and then mingling the profits with money from the drug trade. You can't make this stuff up. That is also an area of great activity and great concern. The U.S. is working in all those areas where there's traditional Hezbollah activity to partner with local governments to crack down on the fundraising and the facilitation work. And I have to say that the Bulgarian announcement yesterday about Hezbollah's responsibility for the Burgas bombing is a major breakthrough and may finally convince Europeans to stop looking the other way and to take seriously a terrorist group that is operating with impunity on their soil. Going to European capitals is not the worst thing that can happen to a coordinator for counterterrorism. It beats some of the other destinations that one goes to. But talking about Hezbollah was something I did for well nigh 4 years, and I have to say personally, I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry about the tragedy in Bulgaria, but I'm glad that we're finally making progress on this one. So as you can see from this review of the landscape, the world of counterterrorism is always changing, and often quite quickly. Now, I would argue that despite that long litany of things to be scared about in the middle of the night, the most dangerous threats have actually receded, and the new ones that are emerging may yet become more dangerous, and we certainly should not be complacent about them. But right now, I think we're in considerably better shape than we were 4 years ago. It's worth dwelling for a moment on the political transformations in the Middle East and North Africa, because they are having a profound effect on our foreign policy, and they have sort of undergirded a lot of the changes that we have seen. But it's important to remember that al-Qaeda was not part of any of those popular uprisings, and that violent extremists across the region are wondering what their place is and how they can exploit these transitions. Now, it's important to remember as well that no one expected change when it finally came to the Arab world to be a painless process. Revolutionary transformations are by their very nature dislocating and wholly unpredictable. And there are risks in the short run that things could go even worse in some of these countries. So we need to continue our engagement, and we need that hard-to-find commodity, strategic patience. We need to work toward our long-term objectives despite the surprises and the setbacks we encounter, especially such horrifying setbacks as what we saw in Benghazi. We greeted the revolutionary events of the last 2 years in the belief that the turn to democracy and accountable government would ultimately deflate extremism and marginalize its advocates. And while there are plenty of people who will argue that that is not likely to happen, I still strongly believe that that logic remains valid. It's early days, and we need to see these transformations through. That's another reason why diplomatic engagement right now is essential. And if you see a theme developing, it's that counterterrorism is not just about military activity and intelligence activity. We've been clear in dealing with the new governments that violent extremists pose at least as great and possibly a greater threat to them and their people's aspirations than they do to the United States and to Western partners. But these countries are preoccupied by difficult economic developments and political and constitutional reforms, and they're hobbled by weakened security institutions. So some of these governments are both slow to recognize the challenge and having a hard time doing so. You have to remember that the ministries of the interior that were in a sense all powerful in these countries under the ancien regime are now deeply unsettled and worried and uncertain what their role is going to be in the future, and they certainly don't want to take any false steps. The attacks on our facility in Benghazi and the extremist violence elsewhere, though, has begun to change attitudes among these governments, and they are increasingly showing the political will to tackle the terrorist threat. In many cases, they lack the resources and the expertise to handle this complex and difficult challenge. So this is a unique opportunity for the international community to help build the capacity of these nations that are increasingly willing to take on terrorism. This task does come with some urgency, and if we don't take it on now, I think we will pay a much higher price later. Some of these governments have doubts about U.S. counterterrorism objectives, and you have to know that counterterrorism in most of these countries is a synonym for government repression. Some seek to implicate us in the repression carried out by former regime security services. And that's really a big challenge for us, and working with them to sort of exorcise these notions is a challenge, and we need to agree with them and underscore to them that a rerun of their predecessors' regimes is not what we seek nor what is needed. On the contrary, though there are numerous factors that feed into the phenomenon of radicalization, I think it's quite clear that at the very top of the list are the repressive measures by security services of the old Mukhabarat regimes. The goal of our counterterrorism assistance is and must be to help countries move away from repressive approaches toward developing true rule of law frameworks. So let's be clear, the better our partners are at using criminal justice agencies to prosecute, adjudicate, and incarcerate terrorists, the less they will resort to extra-legal methods to crack down on domestic threats. And our security benefits when these countries deal with these threats within their borders so that they don't balloon and demand that we act. Mali is a case in point. And when we don't have to act, then we don't have to worry as much about the kind of dramatic steps that inevitably cause a backlash and radicalization. So we're working hard with these countries to develop their law enforcement and justice sector institutions through an array of different programs. Anti-terrorism assistance is the flagship in this area, and that's administered by the State Department. But we're also working to put resident legal advisors in a whole host of different countries where they work intimately with the governments to craft legislation and to train prosecutors, train judges, and show them the way forward on a true rule of law approach. So that's just one example of the kind of capacity building that the U.S. government is doing. There are a lot of other ones that I could list, but I don't think time will permit. But let me just give you one point to show that capacity building can work, because there's often enormous doubt about this. And we do have that famous sentence from Senator Helms, which is echoed through recent history about sending money down foreign rat holes. Indonesia is my favorite example to show that a government that is dedicated to improving its own practice can really make a difference. In the last few years, since Indonesia has really embraced a rule of law approach, it has convicted more than 160 terrorists without losing a case. And the national police has had major successes in breaking up terrorist cells linked to Jemaah Islamiyah and other violent extremist organizations. And if you think back to the period after 9/11, the Bali bombing, some hotel bombings in Jakarta, everyone thought that Indonesia was going to be the next country to tip. And that just hasn't happened because Indonesians, first of all, are far more pluralistic than many other countries, and open and tolerant, and really have embraced this rule of law approach. And I think it's the kind of example that ought to guide us as we think about what else we can do. Well, I said earlier on that we were also determined to do a better job at countering violent extremism, both the pull and the push factors that lead young men to join violent groups. So let me tell you a little bit about what we've done in that area, which has focused a lot on delegitimating the terrorist narrative. To do so, we created something called the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, and this was a favorite initiative in particular of Secretary Clinton. The CSCC does a lot of different things. It's housed at the State Department. It works with our embassies on a range of activities to undermine extremist discourse. Some of the most interesting things are what it does in the online world. Its digital outreach team pushes back openly, that is to say, full attribution, against al-Qaeda propaganda in Arabic, Urdu, and Somali, and it's looking to expand into other languages. In one effort, it conducted an extended campaign, much of it focused on Yemeni tribal websites to counter messages from AQAP in 2012. And this campaign, which included nearly 1,000 online engagements together with banners and videos that mimicked al-Qaeda's own messaging style, but with our language and our countering violent extremism messages, clearly rattled the extremists, which saw how Yemenis picked up on these themes and messages. The extremists, through one of their online front groups, expressed concern about what it called the new U.S. policy of, quote, intellectual and ideological challenge to the mujahideen in the general and jihadist forums and the social and media websites. So we took that to be good news, and we're trying to expand on that. We're also, in our CVE efforts, addressing key nodes of radicalization. And one priority has been prisons. Prisons are among the foremost incubators of extremists. And so working with the UN, we put together a program of best practices and have found money to propagate these best practices to countries around the world that want to improve their prison systems, segregating extremists, for example, and ensuring that those who are at risk of being radicalized are not in contact with the worst violent offenders. This is an area in which I think there's an enormous amount of progress to be made, and I think it's another good news story. Coming back to diplomacy, there's also something to be done in terms of actually forging partnerships in affected regions. In the Sahel, I think, is the best case in point. I mentioned the danger of what happens if someone else steps in, a Western country steps in, and you risk radicalization and backlash, and that's my fear of what will happen if the French stay too long. But the United States has been working behind the scenes to forge closer links between Algeria, which is a strong state, and Niger and Mauritania, two poor states with great political resolve, but not that much in the way of resources. I think it's by doing this kind of work that we're going to have much more effect, much more consequences against al-Qaeda in the region than we will by actually moving in ourselves, which would have, I think, negative consequences. Well, finally, to make these kinds of efforts sustainable, the most important thing is that we can't do it all by ourselves. And that's why we have sought to in a sense, to use a really ugly word, multilateralize this effort. The United States drove the creation of a new 30-member organization called the Global Counterterrorism Forum, 29 countries in the EU, and it's dedicated to capacity building, exactly what's at the top of our agenda. It has built a bridge between traditional Western donors and Muslim countries from Algeria to Saudi Arabia to Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, Indonesia, and Turkey, which is a co-chair, are all members as well. And it has really, I think, made enormous progress in less than 2 years that it's existed. It has raised significant funds to support rule of law programming in many different countries, especially in transition ones. It has created or it has prompted the UAE to create its own Center of Excellence for Combating Violent Extremism, which will be a hub for training government officials, NGOs, community organizers, clergy, and the like in how to craft policies and make approaches that will undermine extremism. Another center that is now in development is going to be in Tunis. It is going to be a rule of law center that aims above all to serve transition countries as they try to train their police, their prosecutors, judges, and legislators to pursue policies that will not result in repression or radicalization. The fact is, I think that this is one of the really successful initiatives in recent years, and it has only really scratched the surface, but I think there's an enormous amount more that can be done. Well, I've already gone on too long, and so I will draw this to a close, but let me just make a couple of concluding observations. First, although our daily newspapers may not be able to quantify this, I think it's pretty clear that the al-Qaeda message is waning in popularity in key populations around the world. And we saw this, for example, in the election of moderates in Libya in July, and in the protests that Libyan citizens mounted against the militias and the extremists after the attack in Benghazi. I think the violence and the chaos that's on offer from these extremists does not resonate with the majority of the people, and that's something that's often overlooked. We see similar signs in other countries. It's not a moment to relax, however. We know that that in terrorism, small numbers have an outsized and even enormous impact, and that with strong leadership or an influx of funding, groups can revive, expand, and cause really great damage. So this is a moment for leaning into the problem of violent extremism and for continuing to degrade terrorist groups and to shape the environment they operate in. Let me just close by posing two questions. What are the requirements for success, and what will success look like? Well, I think the first requirement for success is real public and bipartisan agreement on this kind of strategy that really emphasizes civilian agency engagement, capacity building, and countering violent extremism. And I'll be quite candid. While I think the executive branch is on board, I don't think Congress or the public have had the kind of airing of this discussion or fully embraced this approach yet. And there are a lot of people who still think that foreign assistance is money down rat holes. It will take resources, but it won't take anything like the resources that a primarily military approach would take. What will success look like? Well, terrorism, as I think most of you understand, is not going away. The question really is whether we can manage it so that it is contained and so that those catastrophic high-end threats that we most fear are not possible for those who would try to harm us. In an era of widely available weapons and technologies of destruction, there is simply no wishing away this tactic. And we need to be extremely vigilant about safe havens, because once they exist, we have a real problem that the terrorist groups can become better, extend their reach, and come back to harm us. But I think we do know the way to a safer world, and I think the challenge now is to build the coalition and the common effort to achieve it. So I'm sorry for going on too long, but I look forward to your questions. It's a really interesting question. It's been a subject that's been discussed really since the very beginning of Al-Qaeda. The fact is, in most contexts, when we're talking about Al-Qaeda, there hasn't been a close relationship. In Afghanistan, the drug trade was controlled by the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda didn't get anywhere near it. That was sort of part of the social compact. It has been a huge part of the relation of terrorist activity in South America, for example, where the FARC and the ELN have had drug activities. And part of the Colombian success has been in curtailing that part of the business. The one place where we do see it bubbling up more and more is Africa, particularly in the Sahel, where the terrorists are using the same sort of trading routes as the smugglers, and there may be some growing ties with the drug trade that goes through the Bay of Guinea. So actually, my colleagues who worked in the Bureau of Narcotics, counter-narcotics, and law enforcement are focusing a lot on that region and building capacity with local governments. But it's a tough one. I mean, as long as there is demand, countering narcotics is enormously challenging. I think it's safe to say, though, that so far there hasn't been the connection with the big drug cartels that would really have us worried.
With the U.S. support of the revolutions in like Libya and Syria, how friendly can the U.S. expect like these new popular governments to be like once they come into power?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, and I think it really depends on which country you're talking about. I think actually, if Libya really gets on its feet and can develop some institutions, which is something that they've been lacking since the era of Gaddafi, I actually am pretty optimistic. They've been very pro-American thus far. Syria is just an open question. It is facing state failure, a lot of enclaves of different groups, Alawites, Sunni, Christian, Shia, and there's no prospect for the fighting to end anytime soon. So we don't know what's going to come out of that, and these kinds of civil wars have profoundly radicalizing impact. So I don't really know. I will say we're developing a very good relationship with Tunisia. I think the big question mark over the long term is going to be Egypt, and what kind of relationship we'll have with that country. President Morsi is fond of saying that we were spending $3 billion a year, $2 billion a year to alienate the Egyptian people during the long Mubarak period. And we'll have to see whether that alienation is durable or whether we can craft a really good relationship.
Changing topics. How large of a threat does cyber terrorism pose? And if it doesn't pose a large threat, what structures and resources are currently combating it?
So cyber terrorism has to be broken down. Has to be broken down. There are hostile acts carried out by foreign governments that can be extremely destructive right now, and we've had a number of them in the last year. If you're aware of the attack on Aramco, for example, I mean, it was staggering, and there have been a number of attacks attributed to the Chinese that have also been quite significant. The Aramco attack has, I think, been traced to Iran. Terrorists themselves, non-state actors, have not really shown great capabilities in the cyber world thus far. Can't rule out that they will, but at the moment they're focusing mostly on exploiting the internet for logistics, fundraising, and messaging, which is a problem enough in itself, but they haven't yet learned how to take down significant systems. As is often the case, the U.S. government is throwing enormous resources at this, but I think appropriately so, and the major institutions that are dealing with it are on the military side, the newly created Cybercom, which has enormous resources to deal with this sort of thing. The FBI deals with it. The National Security Agency deals with it. No shortage of players in this space.
one area of North Africa where, some 20 years ago, there was much strife, if not terrorism. And Morocco and Algeria were at odds, and there's French and American assistance. This was it's called the Western Sahara, former Spanish colony. Is that all?
Yeah, one of the most kind of annoying and resilient problems in international statecraft is the Western Sahara. The Algerians and the Moroccans still aren't getting along over it. In fact, their border is closed. You wonder why people are so wound up over some desert that I think has about 50,000 inhabitants and no natural resources to speak of. But it's sort of the Schleswig-Holstein question for the 20th century and the 21st at this point. No one can figure out how to unwind this problem, and it's really thwarting regional cooperation because the Algerians and the Moroccans, although they've had some small warming in relations, still love to poke a finger in each other's eyes. There is a UN process led by a former U.S. ambassador, and he's had countless rounds of mediation, and it's going to take great power intervention to actually move this one.
I had two questions about decisions which are ongoing about our presence overseas. One concerns possibility of a drone base in northern Africa. I'd like to know how beneficial you think that would be. And the second concerns discussions of how many troops will leave in Afghanistan over the long term, and specifically from a counterterrorism perspective only, leaving aside the stability of Afghanistan, which I think is a separate question. But for counterterrorism specifically, how necessary do you think it is for us to have a ground presence there? How much would we be hurt if we went down to zero?
Okay, on the first one, there are limits to what I can say about these programs, and I want to thank all the previous questioners for intuiting that. Let me just begin by saying that there is an enormous need for greater surveillance and intelligence in the region, and that the countries in the region will benefit enormously from a better ability to find the bad guys. So that's about as far as I can go. And but I will say that I think that it is unlikely, not impossible, that the U.S. itself would be taking direct action in the region. So you always have to, when you think about these kinds of assets, you have to distinguish between those that fire things and those that look at things. The ones that fire things look at things too, but the other ones don't. And as for how many boots there will be on the ground in Afghanistan, I don't know. And in fact, I was always pleased that Afghanistan was largely outside of my portfolio because the military was there and they had resources I couldn't dream of. So, it was a military area of operation. I have a hard time imagining Afghanistan without an American presence because I think that the possibility of Al-Qaeda using it again as a safe haven, and they already have been trying to use one remote province again to sort of recreate a safe haven there. It's just, I think, too dangerous. But I'm sure we're going to go pretty far down, certainly from where we've been. Yes?
You made a reference to the short-sightedness or the myopia of the news media to some extent in covering things. But a few days ago, we had an interesting spectacle of the U.S. Senate and the Armed Services Committee. There were over 160 references to Israel and 160 references or so to Iran in the Hagel confirmation hearings by the various questioners. Virtually none about Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, or Mali, and so on, a lot of these key issues. And I just wonder whether sometimes U.S. politics gets a little bit short-sighted and it really, in that itself could be a major problem in terms of developing a coherent strategy.
Do I need to answer that?
maybe I'm throwing the same sort of question he did.
Boy, that's the softest ball I've seen in a long time. Yeah, of course, politics gets in the way all the time. You know, the narcissism of small fights is a huge hindrance to good policy. You know, I remember, just from my own personal experience, once trying to testify to explain what a new Bureau of Counterterrorism in the State Department, which was ultimately created, would do. And behind me there was a huge sea of yellow T-shirts from people who were supporters of the Mujahideen Ikhalq, the much despised Iranian, at that time, designated terrorist group. And in front of me were members of the committee, subcommittee of House Foreign Affairs, who all they wanted to talk about was the MEK. They couldn't have cared less about what the State Department did against terrorism, but it was the MEK that mattered. And at some point, I got to dig out the tape of that hearing, just because people should know what's going on up there. I mean, it's crazy sometimes. But, you know, if you ever want to go back into public life, don't say anything too nasty about the Senate. So we say that, leave it at that. Yes?
I'm not sure you can say much about this, but to what extent
I hate that preface.
does the United States actually seek input from countries on our drone policy? I mean, in some ways, I realize it needs to be, we're going to say it's unilateral, but in terms of building, you know, sort of friendships with countries where the drones are surveilling or actually attacking, it means having some sort of dialogue about it.
Well, let me begin by reiterating what Harold Koh, the State Department legal advisor, has always said, which is we observe international law. And as you know, that entails some activity or some understanding on the part of other countries. When it comes to unmanned platforms, UAVs, everyone in the world wants them. Everyone in the world asks us if they can buy them. So there's a robust discussion going on that issue. And in fact, I wish I had a nickel for every meeting I sat down and someone said to me, "Can you sell me one of those Predators?" So, you know, there is an international discussion going on, and you may be aware of the West Point group, which brings together all the legal advisors from key Western countries, and I know that they have discussed these issues. And so, I mean, there is a discussion. Obviously, some of these programs can't be discussed in any detail, so that has, you know, some downsides. But, you know, it's the worst kept secret in the world, so you go from there.
Could you discuss the attempted assassination attempt on Saudi ambassador? Because
Yeah.
I remember that the media specifically downplayed the threat, said it wasn't really a true threat.
Yeah, the media, understandably, you know, as a former reporter, the media understandably took exactly the same position that numerous countries took, at least behind the scenes, namely, come on, they're not that crazy, you know, hooking up with a drug cartel and trying to whack the Saudi ambassador at a restaurant in D.C., you know, they're out of their mind. And if you took one look at the guy they sent out to do this, you know, you'd say, well, this is insane. But it's a true fact. He did, in fact, contact someone he thought was a part of one of the cartels, someone who's in that drug world, who happened to be a DEA source. So they were kind of snake bitten from the beginning. And they did move forward with this, and there were, you know, lots of very clear pieces of evidence, include taped conversations of this individual about what he was doing and who he was doing it on behalf of, and ultimately he's confessed. And so, you know, it was the real deal. He was related to the Revolutionary Guards, and was someone who lived in the United States for quite a while and wanted to show he was, you know, a real secret agent kind of guy. So it was a real conspiracy. We all rubbed our heads and said, how on earth are we going to make any hay out of this, because no one will believe it. But, you know, intelligence agencies often do crazy things, including those we consider to be the very best. I mean, trying to poison the head of Hamas in Jordan was not too smart on the part of the Israelis, nor was shooting a guy in, you know, Dubai. And, you know, the Israelis are excellent at what they do. So the whole thing, you know, has to be chalked up to the kind of hothouse atmosphere that you get in some of these organizations and the crazy ideas that they produce. But it was a real plot. And ultimately, you know, all that briefing paid off, and the UN General Assembly had a strong resolution to condemn this. Yeah, I had a really great time trying to convince all the permanent representatives that this was as advertised. So, yes.
Yeah, some of the, just following up on that, more than a few recent anti-terrorism successes that have been announced have involved sting operations, involving rather credulous people. To what extent is some of this manufactured, and does that pose a risk of undermining the credibility of other anti-terrorism activities?
It's a great question. These sting operations have been going on forever. They're not new, and they are in nature not that different from federal agents. You know, giving Marion Barry crack to smoke, or giving congressmen bribes. It essentially proceeds on the theory that if they're susceptible and want to do this sort of thing, then you know, and there's a sort of track record of misbehavior, then it's, in the eyes of the courts and in the eyes of the law, legitimate. There are a surprising number of people out there who think that you can buy a shoulder-fired missile from some guy you've never met before. It's really a remarkable phenomenon. Does it undermine the credibility of other efforts? I think the jury's out on that. I think that lots of people like you and me would look at this and say, you know, this is kind of preemptive prosecution. You know, it's getting them before they've actually done real terrorism. And, you know, I think there's some reason to think that. On the other hand, I think a lot of people who probably might have gone on and done something that we really would have regretted have been taken off the streets that way. I'm sure there are military investigators who wish that they had tried to entice Nidal Hassan to do something along these lines before he killed however many people it was he killed at Fort Hood. So, you know, I can understand why there's some unease about it. On the other hand, it is at this point, you know, tried and true law enforcement approach, and not just in counterterrorism.
Do you ever feel that the war on terror has been prosecuted in a horrendously inefficient way? I mean, you often, like a few years ago, there was a major newspaper that came out with a piece detailing how there was bloat in all the major intelligence agencies and how there's not enough communication, how there's too much excessive proliferation of people in these agencies. And then, you know, when we kill these terrorists, you know, we say we can't have them have a single safe haven, but it always seems like we're killing people whose arsenals cost a few $1,000s while using weapon systems that cost millions of dollars apiece.
You know, the American way of war is to throw resources at a problem, and 9/11 was the most traumatic national event we've had certainly since the Kennedy assassination and probably since Pearl Harbor in terms of national security. Were enormous amounts of resources thrown at problems? Undoubtedly. There's a big tightening up going on now. But at the same time, the Congress, the representatives of the American people, have certainly felt that more is better in this area. And the record is pretty clear that there have been very, very few people killed in the last few years by terrorist violence in the United States. On the issue of using a $600,000 weapon to kill an individual terrorist, it's an old argument. I personally think that we should keep investing on the kind of capacity building efforts that we have been discussing, because they are more cost efficient. But you can't have one and not the other. So yes, if we can diminish the pull and the push factors that drive people to terrorism or pull them into it, then we'll have to use many fewer of those expensive weapon systems. A lot of the inefficiencies have come in ways that you wouldn't expect. Creating the Department of Homeland Security cost gazillions of dollars, merging all these different corporate cultures. And frankly, this is the way Congress reacts to big challenges. They build things. The jury's still out as to whether this thing is going to gel and be a very useful agency over the long term. They do a great job now, but there's still all kinds of problems internally. So I guess the answer to your question is the country hasn't really felt that this is an inefficiency it can't tolerate. There has been huge growth in the intelligence community, there's no doubt about that. And I'd like to say that before 9/11, I couldn't find anyone at the Department of Defense who was doing counterterrorism, and afterwards I couldn't find anyone who wasn't. What can I say? The impact of 9/11 was just enormous on the political class, and I think on the nation as a whole. And so that kind of reaction isn't surprising. The part which I think was surprising and hugely costly was the invasion of Iraq, which was, in my view, as I stated well before the invasion of Iraq, a big mistake. That's where we really squandered resources and blood. So, all right, last question, and then I think we have to go. I'm supposed to invite you all to a reception.
Comment on Zero Dark 30.
Yes, and then I'll call on you in the back. It's a complete absurdity to think that there was this one wide-eyed girl who was there at everything that happened. It's absolute nonsense. Bin Laden was killed by a bureaucracy. He was killed by, 1,000 years of Western administrative innovation that brought us to the point where all these different people could be working on very small leads and knit it all together over a long period of time. The notion that there was this one woman who, whose manners were so appalling, who would actually push this machine is just insane, as if anyone in the government wasn't always wondering where he was and how we could find him. So that was absurd. And yes, it was a storytelling conceit, but it was so fundamentally dishonest regarding what happened that you can't get over it. The argument about the discussion of torture has been brought up a lot, and I'm with those who, and I know a little bit about this, the coercive investigations, that's not how they got him. That's, they played a role, but it wasn't the key. Sorry, I shouldn't be touching that. And finally, one of the things which no one has commented on, but which I found particularly offensive, was the depiction of SEAL Team 6 as a bunch of sort of beer-drinking good old boys who were just ambling around waiting to load up and ride on their stealthy helicopters. These guys are incredible. They are, they're all Rhodes Scholars with tremendous linguistic skills. They're physical specimens like you've never met before. They're not the guys who were depicted. They're enormously impressive individuals and with fabulous physical gifts that I find deeply humiliating. But they're really, really impressive, and I thought that they were done a real disservice in the movie. So, I just thought it was a load of you-know-what. Anyway,
If we use the targeted drone attacks in Yemen as an example, is there any evidence in your mind that counterterrorism is creating a whole new generation of terrorists?
I knew I should have stopped while I was ahead. Okay, so I can't really go into this in great detail, and a concern about backlash and radicalization and the notion of how important that subject is has been at the heart of everything that the Obama administration has done, not just on the programs you're talking about, but everything. We're always asking ourselves the question, what are the consequences? And there are different views. If you talk to some of the military guys, they'll say, hey, at the end of the day, we still got to take out someone who's going to try and kill us. So, there's a lively debate on these issues. But I would say, having looked at an awful lot of information on this from a lot of different sources, that the argument that our counterterrorism effort is having enormous radicalization impacts is wrong, and that there are definitely radicalization impacts from time to time, and some of them are unavoidable, and some of them, you have to take the costs with the action. But I think that there's an awful lot of propaganda out there about what the impact of our various efforts are. I think we have to be very, very careful, because it doesn't do us any good if we're driving more people into the arms of the terrorists than we are removing from their ranks. So it's something everyone's thinking about. No one's cavalier about it. But I think that, particularly in some parts of the world, there are governments that are inflating the supposed problem. And in others, people who report on it have different agendas. It's a problem. It's something we need to be careful about, but I don't think that it's as bad as it's been made out to be. So with that, let's go have a drink.